But first, it has been a whirlwind of a week for Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul. He's joined AGs from across the nation to counter the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, freeze on federal funds, and threats of prosecution for state and local officials who block deportations, to name a few. Now, the president's barrage of executive orders, policy changes, and firings since Inauguration Day have left state agencies and leaders scrambling, and Democratic state attorneys general have vowed to check the power of the White House. So how are they doing that? Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul joins us now to discuss. Welcome to Reset.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. Good to talk with you. I want to start with the very latest news. You are one of 22 Democratic attorneys general who filed a lawsuit over Trump's pause on federal funding. Now, we know that a judge blocked that funding freeze, but only until Monday. We're also now getting word that the White House has rescinded this funding freeze. But in the meantime, you can imagine this has caused much confusion in schools, state agencies, and other organizations that, of course, rely on trillions in federal funding. So can you start by clearing things up for us? Does the president have the right, first of all, to do something like this, to cut off federal funding?
No, he does not. And my answer is anchored in the Constitution, both the spending clause and the separation of powers clause. And the other thing that we rely on is the Administrative Procedures Act, which does not allow them to just do arbitrary and capricious acts and such as this. But fundamentally, like other acts over the last 8 days, they've been contrary to our U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. I mean, if this were something that would have moved forward, I mean, what would some of the projects and programs be that are at stake because of a potential federal funding freeze?
It is vast, and I think that's probably what has led to this rescission, right? They're realizing that this is not, and what I've tried to make clear yesterday, this is not something that just impacts blue states or blue areas. This is something that impacts farming. This impacts public safety. I made the point yesterday that we have, in our Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, we've apprehended a record number of child predators, people who prey on kids on the internet. We get funding to do that, to collaborate and to organize our law enforcement partners. So it would compromise that. It would compromise the burn JAG grants that go to police departments throughout the country.
Yeah.
So it's vast. I could go on and take up the entirety of your show.
Well, and we'll dig into some specifics here. And I want to give credit to the Washington Post. The Washington Post obtained a new memo, which, this was after the administration's move to halt this spending, provoked a lot of backlash. So we'll see sort of what comes of this. But this is reporting from the Washington Post that says the White House has rescinded the federal funding freeze here. But, in our case here locally, I'm thinking about the $2 billion that Joe Biden set aside for the CTA's red line extension on the South Side. Could that funding be in jeopardy?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just the red line, it's funding for roads and bridges, for infrastructure around the state. So it does not only impact the infrastructure, but it impacts those who would work on such projects. So it impacts jobs and I should say jobs of many people who voted to elect President Trump.
Yeah. If the Trump administration finds some way around this and some or all federal funding is cut off on Monday, what are the steps that you're going to take to protect children, veterans, hospitals, and others that are counting on government support here in Illinois?
Well, I mean, we had a hearing scheduled for about 2 hours from now, or two hours less from now. I don't know. I'm looking at the memorandum rescission.
Yeah. Right. This is breaking news right now. So yeah, you're just seeing it as well.
Yeah, I just received it, literally minutes ago. And so that may render the hearing moot. Suffice to say, though, we didn't just start working on being prepared for such actions over the past 8 days. We as state attorneys general, quite frankly, have been working over the past several months to prepare for this, even prior to the election, months before the election, not knowing what the outcome of the elections would be, because there were suggestions through Project 2025 as well as through campaign promises of what might come. And so we felt that we could not wait till the very eve of some of these actions to be prepared to respond.
I want to turn now to immigration. ICE agents and Trump administration officials, they showed up in Chicago on Sunday, along with Dr. Phil. CPD says more than 100 Chicagoans have been detained so far. And the president says, his focus is on, quote, criminal aliens. But there have been reports of some longtime residents who have deep community ties also being detained. So give us your thoughts on the federal government's approach so far.
Yeah, I think the numbers, I think nationally, don't bear out a focus on criminals. I think nearly half of the people that have been detained either have no criminal background or have just minor offenses. Listen, every administration, Democrat and Republican alike, has engaged in civil immigration enforcement. In fact, you can argue that President Obama was more aggressive, particularly in his last year, than President Trump was in his first term. And it is the domain of the federal government to work on civil immigration enforcement. So I cannot, criticize generally civil immigration enforcement. But it's been made a joke of. It's been made embedding Dr. Phil into some of your operations, having Dr. Phil interview some of the
Why was Dr. Phil here?
Yeah, it's a publicity stunt, which suggests overall that many of these actions are done as a show instead of your just customary a performance of federal agency responsibilities. I cannot argue just generally against civil immigration enforcement. It is a job that is being given to ICE through the Department of Homeland Security, but embedding Dr. Phil and creating a show out of it, having cameras and so forth, is unfortunate at best.
Interesting. So how is your office then working to ensure due process and legal representation for individuals facing deportation proceedings?
So that's not the domain of our office. We do provide guidance to people in the public generally as to how they can act. We do provide guidance to law enforcement offices throughout the state as to our Trust Act, which mandates that state law enforcement resources cannot be used for civil immigration enforcement, but we do not do individual representation on immigration matters, the same as we don't partake in civil immigration enforcement.
Chicago's welcoming city ordinance limits cooperation with federal immigration authorities. How do you see your role as AG supporting these sanctuary policies?
Yeah, well, with regards to the city ordinance, that's for the city, but in terms of state law, which again, the Trust Act lays out that law enforcement should not use its resources to partake in civil immigration enforcement. We communicate with law enforcement when they're historically, even under the Biden administration, when there's instances that have come up, we've been able to work those out with law enforcement agencies in a collaborative manner, because we maintain ongoing collaboration with law enforcement agencies. And I should say this real quick, that includes federal law enforcement agencies. And one of the things that the administration's actions as cause is something that undermines the collaboration between federal, local, and state law enforcement agencies. They're pitting law enforcement officials against one another, and it's unfortunate. It's not in the interest of public safety.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and we are checking in with Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul. He's discussing his lawsuits against the Trump administration over immigration and freezing federal funding, and the Justice Department threats to prosecute state officials who block deportation efforts. Do want to update our listeners here. NPR is also confirming the Washington Post reporting that, quote, facing legal pressure from our clients and in the wake of a federal judge ruling in our case last evening, the Trump-Vance administration has abandoned OMB's ordered federal funding freeze, and OMB being the United States Office of Management and Budget. So far it's looking like the White House has rescinded the federal funding freeze. I want to move on to birthright citizenship while I have you here, and while we're talking about immigration. Attorney General, you and other attorneys general, that you've sued to stop Trump's executive order banning birthright citizenship. You've called it, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. Give us the status of that, and whether you think there's any chance that we could see the right to birthright citizenship actually disappear in this country. Is this a thing?
I don't think that will happen. My reference to blatantly unconstitutional was me quoting Judge Cogner. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name in the Western District of Washington, who was a Reagan-appointed judge who's been on the bench for decades. So experienced judge who said it was blatantly unconstitutional, and he said further that he does not understand how any member of the bar could come forth and try to defend the constitutionality of such an action. The Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which was advanced in response to the Dred Scott case, states very clearly that those born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and residents of the state where they reside.
Yeah. Do you know this from personal experience? You've described yourself as a, quote, birthright baby. What's your family's immigration story?
Well, both of my parents immigrated to this country in the 50s from Haiti.
Okay.
My father came here as a physician, so I imagine under some sort of professional visa because of the lack of physicians at the time. My mother initially as a student, but had to return and came back, and was not naturalized at the time of my birth. So this is sort of personal to me, as well as other attorneys general, like Attorney General Tong, who's of a Chinese American, and it should be noted that the first Supreme Court case that affirmed this was one dealing with a Chinese baby born to Chinese immigrants.
Yeah. So President Trump has signed a blitz of executive orders that could impact citizens in every state, including removing protections for transgender people, also an executive order ending diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Do you intend on pushing back on any of those?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've been the push, the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion has precedes Trump's election, and I have been pushing back on that, where it's come from corporations such as Walmart, who just a few years after they affirmed their commitment to diversity, abandoned the same. On the heels of George Floyd's murder, the Walmart CEO made a commitment to equity and social equity, and then under pressure from those who have misapplied SFFA v. Harvard, which is the decision that impacted admissions, affirmative actions for higher education education institutions has been applied and has been leveraged by Republican AGs and others to try to intimidate corporations and quite successfully to abandon non-discriminatory programs that attempt to achieve diversity within their respective corporations. And so we will continue in terms of the executive order itself. At this juncture, we don't feel like there's necessarily anything immediately actionable, but we'll see how implementation takes place, and we'll be at the ready.
Democratic state attorneys general, they're shouldering much of the responsibility for keeping this White House in check. Is that how it feels? And can you do that for 4 more years?
Well, I mean, it's been raised up to the public's attention in the last 8 days, but the reality in the last 6 years of my tenure of being Attorney General, we've been fighting these fights consistently, as I just explained with regards to DEI. Whether it's been the administration or private actors or our Republican counterparts who have tried to bring actions, we have been consistently fighting these fights. But it's for better or for worse, it's just come to the public's attention with these audacious executive orders and memorandums coming from the new administration.
And when you think of all that the new administration's done and has tried, does this truly feel like an unprecedented moment? It's a word that we've been hearing quite a bit, and I'm curious what you think the end game is here.
Yeah, I think it is quite unprecedented. I think I spoke at DePaul University yesterday, and they asked me for just a slither of hope. What would that be? And I think it comes out, the silver lining, it comes out in the overreach of this administration, particularly if you look at, for example, the freeze. It impacts so many people who actually, some of the 77 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And so people, while they're being distracted by immigration and distracted by his EOs with regards to things that it impacts transgender, on all the topics that they feel that divide his voters from people that oppose him. Meanwhile, they're doing things to damage the very people who put them in office in the first place. And that's why I think it's unprecedented, where he's lifted up and surrounded himself with the uber rich in the country.
Well, we'll certainly be hearing that word used a lot more over the coming years. We'll leave it there. Attorney General Kwame Raoul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.